Welcome back to the deep dive. And today we are taking a look at a source document submitted by a listener that is, well, it's highly unique.
Yeah, that is an understatement. I mean, it is
Ah.
incredibly rare for us to get a source submission this sparse.
Right. Usually you guys are sending us, 80-page sociological treatises or these dense stacks of complex economic data.
Exactly. But today's material, it's just a single sentence. Looking at this feels a bit like finding an isolated shard of pottery and trying to reconstruct the entire civilization that made it.
Yeah, and I think we have to just acknowledge the humor in that right out of the gate.
Hmm.
We are sitting here preparing to treat a frantic, anonymous internet post with, intense methodical rigor.
The kind of rigor you'd usually reserve for a newly discovered Shakespearean folio, right?
Yes, but that is exactly what we're going to do today. So let me reveal the source material. The document contains exactly 7 words.
Just 7 words. No data, no charts, no surrounding context.
None at all. It's just a single, blunt question copied from somewhere on the internet. And the text reads verbatim. Do women actually enjoy anal sex?
It sounds exactly like a late-night panic search query, doesn't it? Just typed straight into the void.
Oh, totally. But if we put this tiny, seemingly crude fragment under a microscope, it reveals a massive amount.
Right. It tells us so much about how terribly we communicate about intimacy and, how our brains are hardwired to take the lazy way out.
Yeah, and how modern technology has completely warped the way we seek out answers to complicated human questions. But before we get into all that, I need to set the stage for you listening.
That's a good idea, just to clarify the mission here.
Right. Because we strictly adhere to the provided source material on this deep dive, we aren't pulling in outside medical statistics today. We aren't going to read off sociological surveys.
And we aren't bringing in intimacy experts to give you a biological yes or no to the question itself.
Exactly. Our mission is to critically examine the nature, the framing, and the implications of the inquiry itself.
Because trying to answer the question biologically would actually mean falling into the exact cognitive trap that the original author fell into.
Wait, really? How so?
Well, the true value of this document isn't in finding an answer to the question. It's in taking apart the machinery of the question itself.
Okay, let's unpack this. I want to start by looking at the specific vocabulary used here.
I think that's the best place to start, yeah.
Because there is one word in this 7-word sentence that acts as, the entire fulcrum.
You're looking at the word actually, aren't you?
Yes, the word actually. I mean, if you take actually out, you have a straightforward, if incredibly broad, inquiry.
Right. Do women enjoy it? It's broad, but it's a standard question.
But when you drop that word actually in, the whole frequency of the question it shifts completely.
It does. It goes from a simple request for information to something almost conspiratorial.
Yeah, it implies the person asking has been lied to, or at least they feel like they have been.
What's fascinating here is that the word actually does an immense amount of heavy lifting in this sentence. It establishes this immediate tension.
Tension between, what people say and what's real.
Exactly. A tension between a perceived public myth, so what society or media or locker room talk portrays, and a hidden private reality.
Right, so by asking if someone actually enjoys something, the author is signaling a deep distrust of the prevailing narrative.
Yes, they believe there is a facade of performative behavior happening, and they're trying to cut through that misinformation to find the elusive, quote-unquote, real truth.
But hold on, let me push back a bit here, because, isn't that distrust somewhat justified when it comes to human intimacy?
And in what sense?
Well, people do fake things, right? Performative behavior in the bedroom is a very real, very documented phenomenon.
Oh, absolutely. It happens all the time.
So why is asking actually such a problematic way to frame the inquiry if performative behavior is real?
That's a great question. It's not the suspicion of performative behavior that makes the word problematic. It's what the word actually demands as a resolution.
Okay, what does it demand?
Actually functions as a linguistic shovel. The person asking assumes there is dirt to dig through, which, as you said, might be true.
Right, the performative stuff is the dirt.
Exactly. But they also assume that once they dig through that dirt, they are going to hit a solid layer of universal, objective truth.
Ah, they are looking for a definitive binary answer to replace the lie.
Yes. They want to hear, yes, they absolutely do, or no, it's all an elaborate ruse. They want mathematical certainty.
I see. It's like looking at a crowd of people eating black licorice and asking, do people actually like black licorice?
Oh, that parallel hits the nail on the head.
Because if I ask that, I'm acknowledging that licorice is incredibly polarizing.
Right.
Like, maybe I personally think it tastes like battery acid, and I see someone else eating it, so I assume they must be faking it for some bizarre reason.
You suspect performative licorice eating.
Exactly. So I'm searching for an objective, universal truth about licorice. I want someone to hand me a definitive ruling.
Yes, it is objectively delicious, or no, humanity is collectively pretending.
Right. But I'm seeking an objective truth for an entirely subjective sensory experience, which makes no sense.
And that is the exact trap. You cannot find an objective actually in a landscape defined by subjective reality.
Because taste is personal.
Exactly. The reality of black licorice, just like the reality of physical intimacy, exists solely within the nervous system and the psychological makeup of the individual experiencing it.
So the trap of the word actually is that it attempts to force a binary certainty out of a vast fluid spectrum of personal preference.
Which means the person typing this query is essentially using the wrong tool for the job.
They want a shortcut.
Yes. They want a shortcut to understanding something deeply complex, so they use actually to try and squeeze an absolute rule out of a chaotic world.
Wow, okay, so that's the first major structural failure of the sentence.
Right. Which brings us to the second one, and it's arguably a much larger cognitive trap than the word actually.
And what's that?
It's the subject of the sentence itself. Do women.
Oh, right, the monolith.
Exactly, grouping half of the human species into a single noun.
Treating billions of individuals as just one standardized entity.
Right, people spanning entirely different cultures, ages, psychological backgrounds, and life experiences.
Okay, but let me play devil's advocate again here, because
Yeah.
I can hear someone listening right now saying, wait a minute.
What are they saying?
They're saying, we are a biological species. We share baseline anatomy. So why is it a logical fallacy to ask a generalized question about a demographic that shares the same basic physiological hardware?
That is a highly common assumption, but it fundamentally misunderstands how human sensation and psychology intersect.
How so?
Well, yes, there are physiological baselines, but the distribution of nerve endings, the psychological associations with certain physical acts, the context of trust.
The individual's history, right?
Exactly. All of those variables combine to create a completely unique blueprint for every single human being.
So you can have identical physiological structures that respond in wildly contradictory ways.
Yes, based entirely on the individual driving the vehicle, so to speak.
So even if the hardware is broadly similar, the software running the pleasure centers is entirely custom built for each person.
Precisely. The software is unique. And this is where we have to look at the psychological mechanism behind why the author asked the question this way.
Why do our brains naturally want to group billions of custom-built individuals into a single, uniform monolith?
Well, in psychology, there is a concept known as the cognitive miser.
The cognitive miser, what does that mean?
It describes how the human brain has evolved to seek out the most energy-efficient ways of processing information.
Meaning, our brains are inherently lazy.
It's more about survival efficiency than laziness. The brain uses up a tremendous amount of our body's daily energy.
Right.
So to conserve that energy, we rely on heuristics, cognitive shortcuts.
Okay, give me an example of that.
Think about our ancestors. If they saw a large animal with stripes and big teeth, they didn't have the luxury of treating it as a unique individual entity to figure out if it was friendly.
They didn't stop and ask, I wonder what this specific tiger's personality is like.
Exactly. The brain immediately categorized it. Tiger, dangerous, run. Categorization saves computational energy and speeds up reaction time.
So we are literally applying prehistoric survival mechanics to modern intimacy.
Yes, we are.
We encounter something vastly complicated, like the boundless diversity of human preference in the bedroom, and our brain screams, too much data, categorize it, give me the shortcut.
That is exactly the mechanism at play, because it is computationally exhausting to constantly grapple with the infinite variability of individual human autonomy.
It's just too much work for the brain.
Right. It is much, much easier for the brain to process women as a single category with shared predictable traits.
But that cognitive shortcut completely collapses when you apply to something as nuanced as intimacy.
It doesn't just collapse. It becomes actively destructive to the goal of understanding.
Because it demands a simple answer for a complex reality.
Exactly. By grouping billions of people into a single noun, the question inherently demands a binary answer, yes or no.
And if the answer were yes, it implies all women do.
Right. And if the answer is no, it implies none do, both of which are statistical impossibilities.
So the moment you treat a demographic as a monolith regarding intimacy, you basically erase the very concept of individual consent, preference, and bodily autonomy.
You do, which is a huge problem.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, when you are trying to learn about human intimacy?
It means you have to recognize that the language you use to frame your curiosity will always dictate the limits of what you can learn.
So the phrasing of the question itself is the barrier.
Yes. The architecture of this specific question ensures it can never be answered accurately.
Because you're trapped between two bad options.
Exactly. If you accept the premise of the question, you are forced to choose between two completely incorrect absolutes.
You either agree with a sweeping generalization that ignores everyone who doesn't enjoy the act.
Or you agree with a generalization that invalidates the lived, genuine experiences of everyone who does.
Man, it is wild to think about how a 7-word sentence essentially builds an inescapable maze for the person asking it.
It really is a maze.
Which makes me incredibly curious about the meta context of the document. Like, where did this even come from?
Well, let's look at the title. The title you submitted to us for the source, translated from Arabic, is the pasted text.
Right, the pasted text. What does that signify to you?
In Arabic, sent you wol yo yo explicitly signifies something that has been copied from one environment and inserted into another.
So it implies a sense of detachment, like it was ripped out of its original home.
Exactly, it's isolated.
It's digital detritus. And I find myself just fascinated by the mystery of this fragment. Was it a search engine query? A snippet copied from a heated forum debate?
We don't know, but the isolated nature of it is what's so striking.
Yeah, because there's no surrounding argument. There's no named author defending a thesis, no academic throat clearing.
It's just a blunt instrument of a question hanging in a void.
It really is. It highlights a raw, unfiltered moment of human curiosity.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it paints a very specific scene.
A scene of someone sitting alone in the glow of a monitor at 2 in the morning.
Right. Wrestling with a complicated feeling or maybe a confusing experience and just desperately seeking an easy answer.
And I think we need to look at how modern technology has played a role here. Specifically, how search engines and algorithms have trained us to ask these kinds of broken questions.
That is a crucial layer to this. The internet has fundamentally conditioned us to expect immediate, definitive resolution.
Oh, totally. Like if I need to know what temperature to bake a chicken, I type it into a search bar.
And what happens?
The algorithm scrapes the internet and hands me a bolded number right at the top of the page. 375 degrees. Boom. Problem solved.
Exactly. We have become accustomed to using that exact same interface, that exact same algorithmic machine for every single inquiry we have.
We mistakenly believe that because the machine can give us an objective, binary answer for, like, the capital of France.
Or the boiling point of water.
Right. We think it can also give us a bolded, definitive answer for complex human behavior.
We type, "Do women actually enjoy?" into the search bar, fully expecting Wikipedia to pop up with a generalized ruling on human intimacy.
We are outsourcing the hard work of communication to an algorithm that just isn't equipped to handle subjective reality.
And beyond the algorithmic conditioning, there is a profound psychological safety in the pasted text.
Psychological safety? What do you mean by that?
Think about what happens when you ask a broad, monolithic question to an anonymous forum or a search engine.
You mean rather than asking a real person?
Right, what are you avoiding?
Well, you don't have to look anyone in the eye.
Exactly. The monolith protects the questioner from the vulnerability of individual communication.
Because asking a partner a specific, intimate question about their desires requires an immense amount of courage.
It does. It opens you up to the possibility of rejection or mismatched preferences.
Or just having to navigate a really complicated, awkward conversation.
Yes. It is infinitely safer and infinitely less vulnerable to ask a broad, unanswerable question about a demographic to an empty room
Than it is to ask a specific, vulnerable question of the human being sitting next to you.
It's a defense mechanism.
Wow. If you can get the internet to give you a definitive yes or no about women, then you don't have to do the terrifying work of communicating with an individual person.
You can just rely on the perceived universal rule and avoid the vulnerability entirely.
That makes so much sense. So we can't just dismiss the pasted text as a foolish inquiry, can we?
No, we really can't, because information seeking almost always begins with these unrefined, deeply flawed, defense mechanisms.
We don't start our learning journeys with perfectly nuanced, sociologically sensitive
We
hypotheses.
don't. We start blunt. We start scared.
We start by trying to find the easiest shortcut possible.
Then while this single sentence entirely lacks the data or the nuance to provide an actual answer to its own query,
It still serves a vital purpose.
yes, if you know how to leverage it, it serves as the perfect foundational hypothesis. It's the spark.
Okay, so how do you upgrade a question like this? Like if you catch yourself typing a blunt query into the void, how do you pivot?
Well, you look at the blunt question and you identify exactly why it can't be answered.
So you recognize the search for objective truth in the word actually.
Right. And you recognize the massive generalization of the demographic.
And then what?
And you use the failure of that question to seek out better sources. You realize the question isn't about a monolith.
So maybe your next step is like reading about the biological realities of nerve endings and how widely they vary.
We're reading sociological studies about how societal taboos and performative pressures impact how individuals report their own pleasure.
Ah. You move away from the blunt search query looking for a yes or no, and you enter a landscape of nuanced understanding.
Exactly. The pasted text is merely the map pointing to where the complex terrain actually begins.
It's the realization that the simple algorithmic answer you wanted doesn't exist.
And coming to terms with that lack of simplicity is what forces you to appreciate the complexity of the reality that does exist.
I love that framing. So let's step back and look at the journey we've been on with this incredibly brief document today.
It's been quite a journey for just 7 words.
It really has. We took a single 7-word source, and instead of taking the bait and trying to answer the unanswerable, we broke down the machinery of the inquiry.
We started by looking at the linguistic shovel of the word actually,
Right, how it creates a false dichotomy between public myth and private reality.
and how it traps the questioner by demanding an objective universal truth for an entirely subjective sensory experience.
Then we examine the demographic generalization. We look at how our brains act as cognitive misers.
Using evolutionary heuristics to group billions of diverse individuals into a single monolith just to save computational energy.
Yeah, and we saw how applying that prehistoric shortcut to modern intimacy completely erases individual bodily autonomy.
And finally, we looked at the origin of the document as an artifact of the digital age.
We explored how search engine algorithms have conditioned us to expect binary answers for complex emotional realities.
And how we use broad, anonymous questions as a defense mechanism to avoid the terrifying vulnerability of actual one-on-one communication.
It is a stunning case study in how the way we frame our inquiries dictates the absolute limits of what we can learn from them.
It really is.
So if you were sitting there listening to this, we want to validate that raw, blunt curiosity. It is perfectly human to start with the clumsy questions.
We all want the shortcut.
We do. But the goal is to not stay there.
Precisely.
We want to encourage you to reframe how you ask questions about complex human behaviors. Move away from seeking that universal actually.
Catch yourself when you try to group massive populations into monolithic categories.
Right. And instead, start designing your inquiries to help you understand individual nuances rather than searching for an absolute rule that lets you off the hook.
And as we wrap up this exploration into the mechanics of how we seek truth in intimacy, I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over.
What's that?
Well, we've spent this entire time talking about the flaws of turning to search engines or broad societal questions to figure out what humans enjoy.
Right. We look outward to the internet for answers that only exist inward within individuals.
Exactly. So we have to ask ourselves, by focusing so heavily on these broad, generalized questions, by constantly querying the digital void.
Do we risk missing something?
Yes. Do we risk completely ignoring the single most important, most accurate tool we will ever have for discovering what people enjoy?
And what is that tool?
Which is simply finding the courage to look at the individual partner right in front of us and asking them.
Wow. It turns out, sometimes the best way to understand the universe isn't to ask a massive, sweeping question of the void. It's just having a vulnerable conversation with one person.